It's interesting, as I listened to you, I was thinking about option theory, because one of the things we know is that options are more valuable in times of great uncertainty. So ideally, you would have constructed an option if you were Pyrex. But I can't think how they would do it. This is a decision that's got to be made. And so how to create an option to get through this uncertainty is very difficult. So that puts a premium on reducing the uncertainty, because otherwise the cost may become much, much too great. I want to circle back and ask about political will, because I'm intrigued seeing so many European countries that I thought were spineless, all of a sudden being able to make tough decisions. And part of the position we're in now is relative poor performance. And are we going to be worse off if we see a number of politically willful governments in Europe beginning to straighten things out while we don't? Bill, you made your living advising companies. Have you got an answer? He's made his living advising companies. He certainly brought notes.
I start to think about this problem by asking, well, where has this happened before? And where it did happen before, what happened? David referred to the work of the McKinsey Global Institute. The database I have to draw on is the 10 years of research I led, where we studied the economic performance of 13 of the 15 most interesting economies all around the world, and linked their ultimate economic performance to the factory floor, or the equivalent of the factory floor, and basically worked out the causality between what happens on the factory floor or in the service office and the macroeconomic numbers that describe on a broad basis the performance of the country, and looked at the causality in both directions. What happens on the factory floor affects GDP per capita. Actually, the GDP is just the sum of all the things that happen on the factory floor, and yet the things that can also be happening at the macro level can affect very much the decisions that are made at the factory floor and the consequences there in terms of the performance in the factory floor. So when I look at that database with this question in mind, the fiscal crisis that may happen, where in our research did we come across examples that would be useful to reveal actually empirical evidence of what happens in these circumstances? Well, the most important lesson from all that research perhaps was that macroeconomic stability is absolutely necessary for developing countries to perform as they are. Poor countries are poor primarily because they have been unable to achieve consistent macroeconomic stability. They've had one crisis or another of one kind or another over most of their economic history. And without that macroeconomic stability related to interest rates, foreign exchange rates, inflation rates, there is no hope of getting off the floor in terms of economic development. With stability, with macroeconomic stability, then business incentives are totally aligned with good economic performance, are very closely aligned with good economic performance. After all, businesses make profits primarily by increasing the productivity of their operations. There are other aspects of their life that lead to financial performance. Productivity is not the only one, but it is the most fundamental. Because in the end, productivity and profitability are almost directly linked. Productivity goes up if you increase the numerator, which is the economic value of the goods and services you produce. Profits go up if you decrease the denominator in the productivity ratio. If you decrease the real resources that are used, your costs go down. So businesses manage both the numerator and the denominator, the productivity ratio. So productivity and profits are normally aligned, and they create higher GDP per capita when businesses are focused on increasing productivity. However, when there's macroeconomic instability, businesses make money other ways. Businesses will always make money. It's just that they make them in different ways. Foreign exchange, inflation, interest rates, you make bets on those things in one way or another in your investment decisions. And then either because you're smart or you're lucky, some make money and some don't. Two cases stood out when I reflected over the survey around the world of businesses in countries that had significant macroeconomic instability of the kind that Joe Menerick was talking about that might develop here. One was Brazil. Brazil has always been a country who's had a great future in front of it. It never really realized its great future. And back in the 80s, Brazil had extraordinary macroeconomic instability. It had what was called hyperinflation. Inflation rates were in the order of 100% a year or more. And the Brazilians did a great job of convincing the world, both the IMF and the World Bank and everybody else, that this didn't matter. Because after all, they indexed everything to these inflation rates. So they basically mitigated, they adapted and they mitigated the effects of the hyperinflation. So they didn't let the IMF or anybody else tell them that they were crazy. Well, we studied Brazil's economy in the mid-90s and looked at their productivity sector by sector relative to rich country productivities, especially the U.S., but not only the U.S., and found that Brazil's productivity had basically not increased very much since 1960. Yet Brazilian businesses were making money. Many of them were profitable. So how did they do this? How did this work? And after enough interviews and enough discussions with Brazilian business, the clever Brazilian businessmen had turned the focus of their companies and the focus of their strategies not to improving productivity, but to making money off inflation. You can make money off inflation. They spent an awful lot of their time doing very sophisticated things, but the most simple thing they did was perhaps the most effective. They worked very much on the timing of their expenses versus their receipts. And basically, in that kind of macro instability, if you were able to delay your expenses and accelerate your receipts, you made a lot of money, including the fact of giving taxi cab drivers checks every time you took a taxi, because the check had to clear, and you made money off the time between you took the ride and the time the check cleared. So it distorts the incentives for business, but it doesn't mean you won't make money. It's a tragedy for the country, it's a tragedy of people, and ultimately you lose because you don't increase productivity, so you don't get any richer. But it basically changes the way you think about your business strategy. The other example that I thought of was not quite as dramatic, but is also interesting, is Korea and the Asian crisis of 1998. Korea had not a visible source of instability, but it had a hidden source of instability on the macro variables. In that, the chaebols in Korea, which owned the great majority of all business assets in the country, were so diversified that they could make money on certain businesses, and the businesses on which they made their money were the protected domestic-oriented businesses. And then they could venture into big international businesses. They could export cars, steel, what have you. And they could then cross-subsidize within the chaebols from their domestic businesses to their international businesses, which they did unknowingly on a large scale because they consolidated their accounts in a way that nobody knew where they were making money and where they were losing money. But their mistake was they borrowed internationally. And they were not able to pay off that international debt before the Asian crisis hit in 1998. By the way, Japan had much the same situation, but Japan didn't have a crisis because its entrepreneurs in the exporting businesses were so good that they'd earned enough hard currency foreign exchange to pay off all of Japan's international debt before the Asian crisis. Otherwise, Japan would have had a crisis. Korea had not. So the crisis started in Asia. It affected Korea in the sense that the demand for Korean exports was a lot lower, and the domestic demand became more conservative, so there was a slight drop in demand. So the ability to cross-subsidize the international businesses was lost. And of course, they had borrowed internationally at international market rates. So a number of businesses in Japan rapidly became unable to finance their international debt, and as you know, 2 of the 3 car companies in Japan that were exporting heavily became bankrupt. So the misleading signal associated with this kind of instability in Korea was that the international businesses didn't ever have to face their cost of capital. And so they didn't know, they didn't get feedback about whether they were doing the right thing in their investments or not, because on a consolidated account basis, they were making enough money. So instability basically increases the risk to business people, and it distorts their objectives and their incentives. And that's not good news to any business person, because it's tough enough as it is with the market risk, technological risk, personnel risk. I mean, these are difficult enough. But then you add these macro risks, and suddenly business people get very nervous, very uneasy, very uncomfortable, and they become more conservative. I mean, there's just no question about that. And Pyrex is a good example of these things. I think the answer there is pretty straightforward. I mean, if in times of stability, it would make sense for Pyrex to import. It's like trade. I mean, it's capturing the advantages of trade and hedge the foreign exchange risk, because in times of stability, that's not all that expensive to do. But with instability, or the prospect of instability, suddenly hedging becomes much more expensive. So you've got to match your foreign exchange exposures. Otherwise, you can lose a lot of money in a hurry. So I think it's pretty clear that it makes sense for Pyrex to reline their furnaces and negotiate with the unions. It's clearly a second-best outcome for Pyrex, and it's a second-best outcome for the economy. But that's one of the costs of the instability. Macro instability in any large, comprehensive economy, like the U.S. or most of the other rich countries in the world, is totally self-inflicted. This is something countries, and the U.S. would do this if it unfolds the way Joe says it might, the U.S. would do it to itself. We clearly have the tools to analyze and diagnose this situation. There's no doubt about that. We also have the tools to manage the situation. It's clear what solutions are here. Whatever form the instability might take, or whatever form the crisis might take, it's basically a no-brainer about what has to happen. However, you have to have, in addition to the diagnosis, you have to have the will to manage. In this case, the political will to manage. And so the real question is, why not? And maybe in the question and answer we can get to that. Thank you.